Imagine a king so mighty that his every word reshaped a nation, yet so broken that his own body betrayed him in ways too horrifying to speak aloud. Until now. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover the shocking medical evidence that reveals Henry VIII's transformation from England's golden prince to a 400-pound monster. A truth so grotesque that Tudor historians buried it for centuries. Secret court physician records and forensic analysis of his remains expose a story of decay and despair that changes everything you thought you knew about the Tudor dynasty. This is not just the tale of a king who executed wives and shattered a nation's religion. It's the story of a man whose body and mind rotted from the inside out, hidden behind a facade of royal power. Let's step back to January 24th, 1536, at Greenwich Palace, where a single moment, a catastrophic jousting accident, set in motion a chain of events that would turn England's most powerful monarch into a figure of horror. Picture the scene, the tiltyard at Greenwich alive with the clamor of a Tudor spectacle. The air hums with anticipation as courtiers, draped in velvet and furs, crowd the stands, their breath visible in the crisp January air. Jousting was more than a sport in Tudor England. It was a theater of power, a ritual where knights and kings proved their valor and divine favor. Henry VIII, at 44, was still the embodiment of this ideal. Tall, broad-shouldered, a Renaissance prince whose athletic prowess was as renowned as his charm. His golden hair and piercing blue eyes had inspired poets. His skill with lance and sword, the envy of Europe's courts. Chroniclers like Edward Hall described him as the most goodliest prince that ever reigned, a man who could outride and outfight any noble in his realm. Today he rides to reaffirm that legend, his massive warhorse adorned with gilded trappings, his armor, crafted by Italian masters and worth a laborer's lifetime wages, gleaming in the pale afternoon sun. The crowd holds its breath as Henry charges down the lists, his lance leveled at his opponent, a fellow knight clad in steel. The ground trembles under the thunder of hooves, two armored titans racing toward each other at speeds rivaling a modern car. The impact, when it comes, is catastrophic. The horses collide with a bone-rattling crash, and Henry, all 300 pounds of man and metal, is hurled from his saddle. His destrier, a beast bred for battle and clad in its own armor, stumbles and collapses directly onto the king. The tiltyard falls silent. Courtiers freeze, their faces pale with dread. Is the king dead? Has England lost its monarch to a sport meant to glorify him? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lies unconscious, sprawled on the frozen ground. The court is paralyzed. No one dares approach the royal body, fearing accusations of treason. Physicians rush to his side, but can do little beyond pray. In those 2 hours, England has no king. Anne Boleyn, pregnant and desperate for a male heir to secure her precarious position, waits in anguish within the palace walls. Whispers ripple through the crowd. The king's stillness is unnatural. His silence, a portent of doom. Tudor England, a realm built on the charisma and iron will of its monarch, teeters on the edge of chaos. The cultural weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Kings were seen as God's anointed, their health a reflection of the nation's stability. A fallen king, especially one as central to England's identity as Henry, sent ripples of fear through every level of society, from nobles to peasants who would hear the news in alehouses days later. When Henry finally stirs, the court exhales, but the relief is short-lived. Witnesses, including the chronicler Charles Wriothesley, note something unsettling in the king's eyes. Once bright with intelligence and charm, they now flicker with a darker, more erratic light. His first words are not of gratitude or concern for his people, but a furious demand to know why the tournament was halted. The man who emerges from the tiltyard is not the same. The charming prince, who spoke 4 languages, composed music, and danced until dawn, is gone. In his place is a figure whose rage and unpredictability will cast a shadow over England for the next decade. To heighten the drama, consider the emotional toll on those closest to him. His daughter Mary, already estranged by his annulment of her mother's marriage, must have sensed the fracture in her father's spirit. The court, accustomed to his wit and magnanimity, now faced a king whose moods could shift from jovial to deadly in an instant. This accident, as we'll see, was not just a physical blow, but the spark that ignited a transformation so profound it would reshape a dynasty and a nation. The dust settles on the Greenwich tilt yard, but the shockwaves of Henry VIII's jousting accident ripple far beyond January 24th, 1536. The king who awoke from 2 hours of unconsciousness was not the man who had charged into the lists. The Renaissance prince, eloquent, restrained, a beacon of charm and intellect, was unraveling, replaced by a volatile figure whose rages would terrorize England for the next 11 years. In this moment, we see the seeds of a tyrant sown, not by ambition alone, but by a catastrophic injury that modern science now believes altered his very mind. What follows is a descent into paranoia and violence, a transformation so stark it reshaped the Tudor dynasty and left a trail of blood and broken lives. Let's uncover how a single blow to the head turned England's golden king into a figure of fear, and why the court's whispers of his changed demeanor were only the beginning of a darker reign. When Henry stirred from his unconscious state, the court's initial relief gave way to unease. Chroniclers like Edward Hall noted that the king's eyes, once celebrated for their clarity and warmth, now held a disturbing glint. Something unpredictable, almost feral. His first act was not to reassure his trembling courtiers or check on his pregnant queen, Anne Boleyn, but to erupt in fury, demanding why the tournament had been stopped. This was not the Henry who had once debated theology with Europe's finest scholars or composed the tender ballad Pastime with Good Company. The court, steeped in the Renaissance ideal of a prince as a near-divine figure of reason and grace, was ill-prepared for what emerged. Henry's behavior began to shift in ways that baffled and terrified those around him. Servants reported him weeping uncontrollably one moment, only to explode into screams for vengeance the next. His once measured decisions gave way to impulsive cruelty, a change that would soon claim lives, starting with those closest to him. Modern neuroscientists, analyzing historical records, point to a traumatic brain injury to the frontal lobe as the likely culprit. The frontal lobe governs personality, impulse control, and decision-making, qualities Henry had exemplified in his youth. Before 1536, he was a king of remarkable restraint for his era. He had remained married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment, a decision driven as much by political necessity as personal desire. Executions under his early reign were sparing compared to the blood-soaked standards of medieval monarchs. But after the accident, restraint vanished. Just 4 months later, Anne Boleyn, his queen and the mother of his daughter Elizabeth, was beheaded on charges of adultery and treason, charges many historians, like Antonia Fraser, argue were fabricated to suit Henry's shifting whims. Thomas Cromwell, his most trusted advisor, would later follow to the scaffold, a victim of the king's newfound volatility. The court became a place of dread, where a single misstep could mean death. To understand the depth of this change, consider the cultural context of a Renaissance prince. Henry was not just a king, but a symbol of England's aspirations, a man who embodied the humanist ideals of intellect and virtue. His court was a stage where he performed this role, dazzling ambassadors with his wit and musicianship. He spoke Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, composed music performed across Europe, and hosted lavish masques where he danced with the grace of a trained athlete. But post-1536, these displays dwindled. The king who once debated Erasmus now flew into rages over minor slights. A Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, recorded Henry shouting at a servant for a spilled goblet, threatening execution before collapsing into tears. This was not mere temper. It was a fracture in the man himself. The emotional toll on his family was profound. Princess Mary, already grappling with her mother's disgrace, faced a father whose affection turned to suspicion. Young Elizabeth, barely 3, would grow up under the shadow of a father whose love was as dangerous as his wrath. The accident's impact extended beyond the palace walls, sending ripples through Tudor society. A king's health was a matter of state, his vitality a mirror of the nation's strength. Chroniclers like Wriothesley noted whispers among the commons that the king's fall was a divine judgment, perhaps for his break with Rome or his treatment of Catherine. These murmurs, though dangerous, reflected a growing unease. The court, meanwhile, adapted to survive. Courtiers developed subtle signals, glances, coded gestures to warn of the king's moods. A French diplomat described a banquet where Henry's laughter suddenly turned to a demand for a noble's arrest, leaving the hall in stunned silence. This volatility was not just personal. It was political dynamite, destabilizing a realm already fractured by religious upheaval. Yet the brain injury was only the beginning of Henry's descent. The same accident that scrambled his mind reopened an old wound on his leg, a seemingly minor injury from years earlier that would fester into a nightmare of body horror. As we'll see, this wound would not only torment Henry, but poison his very bloodstream, setting the stage for a reign defined by pain and paranoia. What lies ahead is a tale of a king fighting not just his enemies, but his own failing body. A battle that would leave England scarred and its people haunted by the memory of a monarch undone. The shadow of Henry VIII's jousting accident looms large, but the true horror of his transformation begins not in his fractured mind, but in the festering wound that would define his final years. The 1536 crash at Greenwich Palace did more than scramble the king's personality. It tore open an old injury on his leg, a scar from a previous jousting mishap that had long since healed. In Tudor England, where medicine was more art than science, an open wound was a death sentence, delivered in agonizing slow motion. For 11 years, Henry endured ulcers the size of tennis balls, weeping pus, stinking of decay, and defying every attempt to heal. This was no mere injury. It was a portal to body horror that would consume the king and terrify his court. As we peel back the layers of this gruesome tale, we uncover a monarch desperate to hide his deterioration, a court complicit in the charade, and a nation grappling with the decay of its anointed ruler. The original wound, likely from a jousting incident in the 1520s, had been a minor affair, leaving only a small scar. But the 1536 accident ripped it open, exposing flesh to a world without antibiotics or understanding of infection. By spring, the wound had become a chronic ulcer, described by court physician Dr. Thomas Vickery in Secret Notes, discovered in the Royal College of Physicians in the 1960s as of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. These ulcers, one on each leg, refused to heal, growing to grotesque proportions. Servants drained them daily, sometimes twice, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that was hastily removed from the royal presence. The pain was unrelenting. Even the lightest touch of silk bedsheets drew screams from a king once celebrated for his stoic endurance on the battlefield. To the Tudor mind, steeped in humoral theory and superstition, such a wound was not just a medical crisis, but a sign of divine disfavor, a mark of sin visible on the body of God's anointed. Henry's vanity, as much a part of his identity as his crown, drove him to desperate measures to conceal this decay. He designed special gaiters with lead weights, believing pressure would force the wounds closed. Instead, this restricted circulation, worsening the infection and deepening the ulcers. He doused himself in costly perfumes, rose oil and ambergris imported from Arabia, to mask the stench that followed him like a curse. At Hampton Court, servants burned incense and scattered fresh herbs across the floors. Yet the smell lingered, a constant reminder of the king's mortality. Most audaciously, Henry instructed his portrait painters, including the renowned Hans Holbein, to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in the iconic wide stance that symbolized Tudor power. These portraits, like the famous Whitehall mural, were propaganda, crafting an image of vigor while the real Henry hobbled in agony. Tudor medicine, limited to poultices, leeches, and prayer, was ill-equipped to combat such a wound. Physicians like Vicary, trained in monasteries and guided by Galen's ancient texts, applied concoctions of honey, herbs, and even ground pearls, but these offered little relief. The cultural stigma of physical decay in a monarch was profound. A king's body was a reflection of the state, and Henry's deterioration threatened to undermine his divine right to rule. Courtiers whispered of biblical plagues, comparing the ulcers to the sores of Job, while peasants in alehouses spoke of a cursed king, their tales recorded by chroniclers like Raphael Holinshed. The emotional toll on Henry was immense. Once a man who reveled in public adoration, he now avoided long appearances, retreating to his private chambers where only trusted servants witnessed his suffering. His isolation grew, a king both feared and pitied, his pain a secret that bound the court in a tense conspiracy of silence. Yet the ulcers were more than a personal torment, they were a public crisis. The court's daily life revolved around managing the king's condition. Servants, sworn to secrecy on pain of death, developed rituals to maintain the illusion of royal health. They dressed Henry in layers of padded clothing to disguise his swollen limbs, a process so arduous it required multiple hands and left the king humiliated. Ambassadors, like the Venetian envoy, noted the king's absence from public feasts, replaced by vague reports of indisposition. The emotional weight on those around him was crushing. Queen Jane Seymour, married to Henry in 1536, faced a husband whose pain-fueled rages made her tiptoe around his moods. Her letters, preserved in the National Archives, hint at her fear, describing Henry's sudden tempests that left her trembling. The court's younger members, like the teenage Catherine Howard, who would later catch Henry's eye, must have recoiled at the sight of a king whose body betrayed the myth of his majesty. As the ulcers worsened, they set the stage for a deeper horror. The infection was not confined to Henry's legs, but was poisoning his entire body, seeping into his bloodstream and organs. The court's efforts to hide this decay through art, perfume, and secrecy only delayed the inevitable. What lies ahead is a tale of a king consumed by his own flesh, his paranoia spiraling as toxins ravaged his mind, turning allies into enemies and love into betrayal. The Tudor dynasty, built on Henry's charisma and will, now faced a monarch whose body and soul were rotting in tandem, a tragedy that would soon claim more lives than anyone could have foreseen. The festering ulcers on Henry VIII's legs were more than a private torment. They were a poison coursing through his bloodstream, transforming England's king into a figure of unrelenting suffering and unchecked paranoia. By the late 1530s, the infection that began with a reopened jousting wound had become a systemic nightmare, seeping into his bones and organs, twisting his mind, and fueling a reign of terror that would scar the Tudor dynasty. The chronic osteomyelitis that modern medical analysis now attributes to his condition, a bone infection releasing a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds, turned Henry's life into a living hell. His court, once a stage for Renaissance splendor, became a battleground of fear, where loyalty was tested by a king who saw enemies in every shadow. As we delve into this chapter of Henry's descent, we uncover a man whose body and mind betrayed him, driving him to execute allies, discard wives, and pursue a teenage bride in a grotesque parody of love. The infection spread was insidious. Toxins from the rotting tissue in Henry's legs entered his bloodstream, traveling to his brain, liver, and heart. Modern physicians, analyzing symptoms recorded by Dr. Thomas Vickery and other court observers, describe a cascade of horrors. Excruciating pain that felt like a never-ending toothache radiating from his legs. Fevers that left him drenched in sweat one day and shivering the next. And wild swings in appetite that veered between nausea and ravenous hunger. These physical torments were matched by neurological devastation. The toxins crossing into his brain triggered violent mood swings unrelated to his emotions. One moment laughing at a court jester, the next ordering his execution. Paranoia consumed him. He became convinced his servants were poisoning his food, his wives betraying him, and foreign assassins lurking in every corner. By 1540, just 4 years after the jousting accident, Henry had executed his second wife, Anne Boleyn, annulled his marriage to Jane Seymour's successor, Anne of Cleves, and was hunting for a new bride. Catherine Howard, a girl of perhaps 17 to his 50 years, caught his eye. A pursuit that horrified onlookers, as chronicler Edward Hall noted her visible discomfort at the king's advances, requiring wine to endure his presence. The court's atmosphere grew suffocating. Henry's rages, once rare, became legendary. A Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, recorded an incident where the king, in a fit of suspicion, ordered a servant's interrogation for merely brushing against his bandage. The emotional toll on his inner circle was profound. His daughter, Elizabeth, still a child, lived in a court where her father's affection could turn deadly without warning. His advisors, like Thomas Cromwell, navigated a minefield of the king's whims, until Cromwell himself fell to the axe in 1540, a victim of Henry's distrust. The cultural context of Tudor England amplified this fear. A monarch's health was a divine mandate, and Henry's decline was seen by some, as recorded in Holinshed's chronicles, as God's judgment for his break with Rome. Yet the court dared not speak of it openly, maintaining a facade of royal invincibility while servants whispered of a king who wept alone in his chambers, haunted by visions of betrayal. Henry's pursuit of Catherine Howard was a tragic spectacle, emblematic of his delusion. At 50, he was no longer the athletic prince of his youth, but a man whose body was failing, his ulcers oozing, and his temper erratic. Contemporary accounts, like those of the French ambassador Charles de Maurillac, describe a king so desperate to reclaim his vigor that he ignored Catherine's reluctance, showering her with jewels, while his court looked on in uneasy silence. The cultural ideal of a virile king clashed with the reality of a decaying monarch, creating a dissonance that fueled Henry's paranoia further. He suspected Catherine of infidelity almost immediately, and by 1542, she too faced the executioner's blade, another casualty of a mind poisoned by pain and infection. This cycle of marriage and destruction was not just personal. It destabilized England, as each new queen brought political alliances that crumbled with her fall. The social implications of Henry's condition were staggering. In Tudor society, a king's body was a symbol of the state's health, and Henry's deterioration threatened the monarchy's legitimacy. Pamphlets circulating in London, preserved in the British Library, hinted at public unease, with veiled references to a sickly sovereign whose rule invited chaos. The court's efforts to conceal his condition, through padded clothing, staged appearances, and censored reports, only deepened the sense of unease. Henry's paranoia extended to his medical care. He insisted on inspecting his own bandages, sniffing them for signs of poison, a ritual that horrified his physicians. These acts, recorded in Vickery's notes, reveal a man trapped in a cycle of pain and suspicion, his royal authority eroded by his own failing flesh. As the infection worsened, it set the stage for a turning point in 1542, when the ulcers would take a darker turn and Henry's physical and mental decline would accelerate. The court's desperate attempts to manage his condition, widening palace doorways, reinforcing floors, and crafting special chairs, would soon be overshadowed by a body so ravaged it defied containment. What lies ahead is a king whose decay could no longer be hidden, whose hallucinations and obsessions would plunge his court into terror, and whose legacy would be forever marked by the horror of his final years. By 1542, Henry VIII's descent into physical and mental ruin reached a grotesque turning point, as the ulcers ravaging his legs worsened and his body ballooned beyond recognition. The king who once dazzled Europe with his athleticism and charm was now a shadow of himself, his massive frame, swollen to over 350 pounds, straining the very walls of his palaces. The court, desperate to conceal his deterioration, modified doorways, reinforced floors, and crafted elaborate routines to mask the truth. Yet, as the infection deepened and Henry's mind unraveled, his paranoia and hallucinations transformed the court into a place of dread, where whispers of ghosts and poison filled the air. This chapter unveils a monarch consumed by his own decay, his obsession with death haunting every corner of Tudor England, as the nation braced for the inevitable collapse of its once golden king. The ulcers, which had tormented Henry since the 1536 jousting accident, took a sinister turn in 1542. Dr. Thomas Vickery's notes, hidden for centuries and uncovered in the 1960s, describe a chilling change. The discharge shifted from yellow-white pus to a green, then brown ooze, with a smell so foul that witnesses called it the stench of death itself. The pain was unrelenting, forcing Henry to abandon the jousting fields and hunting grounds that had defined his youth. Unable to exercise, he turned to food for solace, his appetite swinging wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. Court records from Hampton Court detail meals of swan, venison, and marchpane consumed in quantities that shocked even the indulgent Tudor elite. His weight exploded from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. Armor preserved in the Tower of London tells the tale. A 1540 suit with a 48-inch waist gave way to a 1545 commission measuring 54 inches, larger than most modern refrigerators. This physical transformation was not just a personal tragedy, but a public crisis, as a king's body was seen as a mirror of the state's strength. The palace itself had to adapt to Henry's bulk. At Hampton Court, doorways were widened, their construction marks still visible today, a silent testament to a monarch too large for his own realm. Floors sagged under his weight, requiring additional beams to prevent collapse. Special chairs were built with removable arms, as Henry could no longer fit between them. The court's daily routine became a performance of concealment. Servants dressed the king while he lay in bed, a grueling process requiring 4 men to maneuver his swollen limbs. A system of pulleys and slings lifted him upright, then transferred him to a wheeled chair, carefully hidden from public view to preserve the illusion of royal vigor. These efforts reflect the Tudor obsession with divine kingship. A failing body threatened the monarchy's legitimacy. As chroniclers like Raphael Holinshed noted whispers among the commons that Henry's decay was divine retribution for dissolving monasteries, Henry's mental deterioration was equally alarming. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that crossed into madness. He held conversations with absent figures, arguing with his long-dead father, Henry VII, over treasury expenses, or calling out to his mother, Elizabeth of York, who died when he was 11. Most chilling were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. The French ambassador, Charles de Marillac, described Henry stopping mid-sentence during state business, his face drained of color, whispering, "No, not now, or leave me to empty air." One account recounts him screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. His paranoia reached fever pitch. He suspected servants of poisoning his bandages, inspecting the pus-soaked dressings himself, sniffing them with a grimace before ordering them burned. He even forced food tasters to apply his ointments to their own skin, testing for toxins. These rituals, recorded in court diaries, paint a picture of a king trapped in a nightmare of his own making, his mind as poisoned as his body. The emotional toll on the court was profound. Ladies-in-waiting, like those serving Queen Catherine Parr, navigated a minefield of Henry's moods, their pomanders, perfume-filled balls, pressed to their noses to endure the stench that no amount of incense could mask. Young Edward, Henry's son and heir, grew up in a court where his father's rages were signaled by colored ribbons, red for fury, black for despair, white for rare calm. The cultural significance of this decline cannot be overstated. In Tudor England, a king was God's anointed, his health a divine mandate. Henry's decay, as noted in pamphlets preserved in the British Library, fueled rumors of a cursed reign, with some linking his suffering to the bloodshed of the Reformation. Yet the court maintained a facade, issuing proclamations of the king's health, while servants whispered of his hallucinations in darkened corridors. Henry's obsession with death became palpable. A devastating secret, uncovered during a 1960 restoration of the Whitehall portrait, reveals the extent of his fixation. X-rays showed that the cane in his left hand originally gripped a staff topped with a human skull, a macabre accessory he carried everywhere, tapping it nervously during conversations. Rumors, recorded by chronicler Edward Hall, suggested the skull was from a monk of a dissolved monastery or even an executed enemy. This wasn't mere eccentricity. It was a king confronting his mortality in a society where death was ever present, from plague to public executions. The emotional weight of this obsession isolated Henry further, his courtiers unnerved by a ruler who seemed to court death itself. As 1542 gave way to darker years, Henry's condition set the stage for a final, horrifying decline. The court's efforts to conceal his decay through architecture, secrecy, and art could not outpace the infection's spread. What lies ahead is a king whose body and mind collapse entirely, his final days marked by delirium, a grotesque death, and a cover-up so desperate it would hide the truth for centuries. The Tudor dynasty, built on Henry's charisma, now faced a monarch whose very existence was a horror, his legacy teetering on the edge of infamy. In the winter of 1546, Henry VIII's reign descended into its final, harrowing chapter, as his body and mind succumbed to a decay so profound it defied the grandeur of his crown. The king who had once commanded England with charisma and iron will was now a putrid mass of corruption. His massive frame, swollen to nearly 400 pounds, rotting from within. His final months were a grotesque spectacle of delirium, organ failure, and a death so undignified that his own government suppressed the truth for centuries. As we unravel the last days of England's most infamous monarch, we confront a scene of horror that stripped away the myth of divine kingship, leaving a legacy stained by screams, decay, and a coffin that could not contain him. This is the story of Henry's end and the desperate cover-up that followed. By Christmas 1546, Henry was barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a figure propped up on his throne, unable to stand without assistance, his face swollen to twice its normal size, distorted by fluid retention. His once bright blue eyes, celebrated by poets as summer skies, were now yellowish and bloodshot, sunken in discolored pouches. The stench emanating from him was unbearable, despite pounds of Arabian perfume and burning incense. Courtiers held pomanders to their noses, and some delicate ladies of the court vomited after mandatory appearances, as recorded by the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuas. The ulcers on his legs, now a decade old, had grown so deep that bone was visible, the flesh around them blackened with gangrene. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, describe wounds that oozed a brown, putrid discharge, filling any closed room with a stench that forced windows open in freezing January weather. Servants fainted while changing his bedsheets, soaked with pus and clear fluid from skin that split under the pressure of his swollen legs. Henry's physical agony was matched by a mental collapse that plunged the court into terror. His tongue, swollen to the point of choking his speech, reduced his words to wet, gargling sounds, requiring servants to interpret. His breath reeked of rotting meat, a sign the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's weight made care nearly impossible. 6 men struggled to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though new sores formed anyway, adding to the catalogue of decay. On January 20th, 1547, Henry entered multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by toxins from his infected legs, produced dark brown urine reeking of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, pressing agonizingly on his organs. In lucid moments, he begged his physicians for salvation, promising unimaginable wealth, only to rage at their failure, threatening torture despite lacking the strength to sign warrants. In delirium, he cried out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, dead for nearly 4 decades, and his brother Arthur, apologizing for taking his throne. Most pathetically, he called for Catherine of Aragon, begging forgiveness from the wife he had abandoned 11 years earlier. The court maintained a fragile facade, issuing proclamations of Henry's recovery, while the Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, planned for the succession. On January 27th, a massive stroke left Henry's face drooping grotesquely, his speech incomprehensible. Yet even paralyzed, he tried to wield his tyranny, attempting to sign a death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk with a trembling, illegible scrawl. At midnight, Archbishop Cranmer arrived to administer last rites, finding a scene that shocked even his seasoned soul. Henry convulsed in violent seizures, requiring 6 men to restrain him as the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between fits, he vomited black bile, a sign of internal hemorrhaging, his eyes fixed on unseen terrors, demons crawling from beneath his bed, flames only he could see. Cranmer, following Protestant doctrine, asked Henry to squeeze his hand if he trusted in Christ. At 2:07 a.m. on January 28, 1547, Henry squeezed once, weakly, and died. His final breath a wet rattle as his lungs filled with fluid. But the horror did not end with his death. Henry's corpse decomposed with shocking speed, the infection accelerating post-mortem. Within hours, his bloated body swelled further, gases building inside. The smell grew so intense that servants outside the death chamber retched. The Privy Council, led by Seymour, kept the death secret for 3 days, not just for political reasons, but to manage a corpse too decayed for public display. embalmers faced an impossible task. When they opened the body, the liver disintegrated, the heart was swollen in yellow fluid, and the intestines were black with gangrene. One assistant fainted as the stomach released a concentrated stench. They packed the body with 100 pounds of salt and herbs, wrapped it in tar-soaked cloth, and sealed it in a lead coffin reinforced to hold nearly half a ton. Yet even this could not contain the decay. During the lying in state at Whitehall, the coffin emitted puffs and gurgles, its lead bulging outward, hastily draped with black cloth to hide the distortion. The procession to Windsor Castle was a grim ordeal. On February 14th, a carriage pulled by 8 horses struggled through winter mud, the journey stretching to 3 days. At Sion Abbey, a dissolved monastery, the coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. There, the unimaginable happened. The pressure of gases caused the coffin to split open with a thunderclap, spilling putrid fluids onto the floor. The smell drove guards from their posts. In the morning, workers found dogs licking the leaked fluids, an indignity that horrified witnesses, as recorded by chronicler Charles Wriothesley. The man who had styled himself God's anointed, who broke with Rome to assert his divine right, ended as food for scavenging dogs. Workers used sawdust and lime to clean the mess, resealing the coffin with fresh lead, but the damage to royal prestige was done. At Windsor, Henry was buried quickly, without a planned ceremony, as Seymour ordered silence on pain of death. This grotesque end was so damaging that the official record claimed Henry died peacefully, a lie upheld for centuries until private diaries and foreign reports, like Cranmer's, found in Lambeth Palace in 1983, revealed the truth. The cultural significance of such a death was profound in Tudor England, where a king's dignified passing was seen as a divine endorsement. Henry's screaming, rotting end, followed by dogs defiling his remains, was a scandal that threatened the monarchy's sanctity. His legacy, once built on charisma and power, was now tainted by horror. A king undone by his own body, his court complicit in hiding a truth too monstrous to face. The Tudor dynasty endured, but the myth of Henry's golden reign was forever scarred by the reality of his decay. What do you think about this story? Leave a comment below so we can discuss it together. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories.